Who we starting with, Brian? Going down the line.
We'll go down the line. We'll start with.
Okay. I never have been or never will be a planner. I'm a pantser. That I just sit and I have a stream of consciousness I use. That leads me from one scene to the next scene, and just as I go along, like a 30 movie serial, I just leave a cliffhanger and think for a couple days and just go back, and that's how I resolve it. I have like an overall goal when that I want to reach at the end of the book. I know the end of the book before I start writing it. So I know where I'm headed. I'm just not sure how I'm getting there.
Okay.
No, I don't always know the end. I usually will write whatever scene presents itself to me. I have a general idea of where I want to go, but I found that ideas, if you have kids or nieces, nephews, kids in your neighborhood, you know that your ideas are like kids. When you want them to open up and fill you and communicate, they're like the Sphinx. And when you're trying to do something else, they will not leave you alone. 2 in the morning, or when you're in the middle of something else. And I think you just have to kind of be a little bit open to that. So wherever the idea strikes, I start writing it, and then sometimes it looks like sort of a mosaic, and I have to kind of stitch it together.
I can say honestly that this one was a linear write, because I started with this lost vet, which was my friend saying, "Oh, I know you can have a thought that lasts more than 5 minutes, so write me some words." And he actually writes murder mystery theater, so that's kind of boilerplate, but he writes other fiction too. He's like, "I know you can do this." So I said, write him 1,000 words, and he's like, "I want to know why she thinks this and why this is happening." I'm like, "Oh, great." So I committed myself. And then as I got into it as a fun project, then it took on a life of its own, and I did write it linearly. But I see everything as a movie. So I see scenes and I see interaction. Then the challenge is for me to describe that furtive glance or whatever, and give you what's going on in the back of why they are acting that way, behaving that way, why you see what you see. This thing I'm working on now, the prequel, is different because I'm seeing those scenes in all different places, and I know how I want the end to come out. But all of the middle stuff is really difficult. So I wrote chapter after chapter after chapter for this one and just went straight down the list. With this one, I started out with the opening scene. I've written a chunk of the middle. I've got a romance interaction here. I know that this disaster is happening over here, and I use Scrivener as my writing software. So fortunately with Scrivener, it makes it very easy. You can just move a chapter here, move a chapter here. You can export. It's great, cheap software. It's like $40, and it's fabulous. But it's a very different process with this book. So I don't think I have a process per se, except when it comes to me, I work on it. When I'm not hearing anything, I leave it alone. Because if I have a job, I hate my life. So my goal is that I don't ever do anything that really feels like a job, because a job is an obligation and a box. And we know how I do with boxes. So I've decided to not have a job. And so writing still has to be fun for me, because otherwise I can't be engaged.
I think sometimes some people get so beholden in the process that they don't end up listening to where the characters want to go, or where the voices want to go. And see, I am an outliner. I would define myself as an outliner first, and I think people are still afraid of like having to do, 1A, 2B, insert whatever. And it's like that outline can be whatever you make it to be. I have to have some kind of plan in advance. There's room to meander, but to me, it's like I have a jot down of ideas. I will also do story cards, my mother hated because I would put cards all over the wall, and then as scenes got rearranged, a piece of wall would come off as the tapes were being rearranged. And when I do that, it's like when I'm to my first draft, I've already already had a draft, and then I still handwrite. As I said, I'm slow. So when I'm going through that handwriting where I'm marking everything out, there's something more tangible about the scribbling and feeling the page and everything. And then when I go to type that, of course, sure, there are times where I'm kind of like, I can't even read my own writing. What the heck is that? Where I'm off having to add on into the process. But again, it's also like, that's my next draft. So it's kind of like, I'm not so beholden by an outline. And if anything, it's kind of like I'm building in layers where the crafting and the process is going on. And then I will still print everything out and read everything over again and mark everything up. So I don't know how anybody can just go with it. I cannot do that.
I would deforest an entire world just with paper if I did that, because that's the beauty of using,
I have finally begun donating to the libraries and schools, stacks of notebooks and liner paper that I've had for years that have started to turn yellow, where I've said, okay, maybe I'm not going to use that much paper this time. But I don't know if that's an old school thing to outline, or I find as we go to these events and we discuss, I find there's less and less, technically outliners.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the definition has changed or the style has changed.
Well, that's why they have that hybrid Plantster thing.
Plantster?
Yeah.
Plantster.
You haven't heard of
When I
Plantster?
taught
Composition,
my rule of thumb was, you don't need to outline if you can take something you wrote and extract an outline from it.
Yeah.
And I like you said, you came from press. I don't know if being from newspapers and magazine and nonfiction has also helped to, in some ways, concise the kind of process format because I've been in another kind of job where I have been worried about a set limit or set format or set word count.
Right.
So then I'm able to intercross and connect and expand where I need.
It's just.
But you don't outline your universe. And again, when you're doing a series, especially if you're doing a series from a traditional publisher, you have to have at least some sort of map of where each book is going, how many books this is going to take.
Right. And because the science fiction series was originally handwritten out longhand, binders, huge binders.
Oh yeah.
That when I transcribed them at first, and that was my first major edit onto a computer in the early 2000s, it was my opportunity to do some of the moving around. That maybe as I was going through it, I realized this wasn't going to work unless I put this little clue in beforehand or whatever. So, but as a storyteller, understanding the nuances of how stories go and the want of readers for some sort of satisfaction at the end, I'm more organic of a writer, so I might start out, well, let's just throw a few sentences on and see where it goes. But if I have a character or I have a situation or a combination of both, it's a matter of, okay, well, at this point in the story, nothing's really happening. What sort of obstacle can I throw in front of the character and see where it goes? If the characters are fleshed out enough that they have a life of their own, they're the ones that more or less dictate where the story's going to go. I may have an intended ending, but if the characters go off, sometimes but I need you to be here at the end, and you're pulling them back. At some point, you have to say, well, the story goes as the story goes, and that's where the outline lets you down. So even though I will use an outline if I get stuck, I go back and start outlining what I have written, so maybe I can find the hole that has stopped me where I am. Other than that, I really don't have outlines, but I do have cards, and I do make reference to past books. Luckily, being on a computer, you can do a word search. If you're like, I can't remember what color this guy's eyes are. I was going to kill him off, but he was too much of a character, so I still have, and I need to make reference, what color was his eyes? So you have to go back to a previous version and find it. If you don't necessarily have the paperwork, I have little index cards with, the characteristics on it too. So a combination of anything that works is what you use. So.
It's really how your brain processes information.
Exactly.
You have to customize to that. So if you're a visual person, then go with what you see in your head. If you're an auditory person, or if you're a tactile person, like, it's all a learning style that you might have, is how you process the world and how you process your information.
How do you pronounce it? Scrivener. Now, I mean, I know a lot of people who like to, record their voice, where they're just talking it out, and then dictation kind of software. So there's like a lot of things that can help you. As well.
I actually did that when I started halfway through the book, because the person I had to bet with drives a lot and will drive like from Providence, Rhode Island to Boston. Well, you're like an hour and a half or 2 hours in traffic sometimes. And so he said, record what you write and I'll listen to it in the car. Well, in the process of doing that, I had to listen to the recording and I'm like, oh, that sounds like crap. And so I would go back and I would rewrite because not only did I want it to read well, I wanted to hear it well.
Right.
Like,
I noticed that the first time I got my audiobook, the first audiobook I ever got, I got to experience listening to my own work being read by someone else. It changed my my attitude on my writing, and there were so many things I would listen. I would go, oh, you know, that sentence worked on paper, but God, you know, just listening to it, I want to change it now.
Out loud.
Yeah.
I've
It's a
said
good
this
tool for
before.
revision, is to read it
I
out
will
loud.
read everything
I'm
out
an
loud. Now, the
outlier.
nonfiction, sometimes I can do the dictation software, but when you're doing fiction and you're making up all crazy names and stuff, it never gets it, and it always is more trouble than it's
I
worth.
tried using
But I will read everything out loud to see how it sounds.
Yeah, see, I'm like Kristin though, I'm an outlier.
Oh, yay!
I outline all of my stuff. I keep making the outline longer and longer until I've got as much detail as I can fit in there to where the next logical point is just write the scene. You know, just start writing. But I find, because I'm somewhat lazy in that once I write something, I really don't want to rewrite it. I don't want to sit there and take a first draft book and rewrite it from beginning to end or redo big, huge parts. So I'm all about, nope, it's gonna be as right as I can get it the first time, and then I have my people that read it for like editing and grammar and stuff, and will make suggestions of this sentence, you know, doesn't need to be there, or this is too long, or this is confusing to read, and I will catch that stuff. But for the most part, by the time it gets, you know, into the first draft, I've already hammered that thing out. I've hammered that thing out. Yeah.
That was one of the hardest things for me, like writing this next book that I went back. I'm in the process of doing the second draft, and I had a section that I absolutely loved. It was really creative, you know, and when I got to the second draft, it just didn't fit, you know, and it was the hardest thing. It was like putting up one of my children for adoption. You know, that I had to like take this out of the manuscript.
That's what Stephen King always said. He said sometimes you have to kill your darlings.
Yeah, kill your darlings.
I always revise that to say kidnap your darlings, don't kill them, because
That's true. You might use
very
that.
often you
them
can use
in
them
some
somewhere
other
else.
form.
I'm a recycler.
Yeah.
So kidnap them, put them somewhere else.
You brought up a really good point though, with the audio, how it changed the way you perceive things, and I know we don't have time to really dip into this, but you know, audiobooks are, again, like Audible self-publishing.
Yeah.
And with Audible, they make it really easy to do it, and a lot of people who don't have time will listen to a book sooner than they'll read an ebook or read a paper book. And there is an entire market of visually impaired folks that cannot do anything but listen to ebooks, and people who travel great distances and all that. So I've got a friend who's like, when are you going to do the Audible book? And I'm like, I don't know, I just got done doing voiceover for somebody else's book, so I don't know when I'm going to do it for my own. He's like, well, that's when I'll read your book, when I can listen to your book. I'm like, ooh. But Audible makes it so that especially if you've got a good voice or you have clear diction, if you record it, you know, they want to hear it in the author's voice.
Yeah,
Which
prefer that, yeah.
You're right, because you know your book, you know what's going to happen, and you have the
cadence and the stress
exactly.
and the voice.
And for certain people who tend to be very interesting, like Caitlin Doty, who is Ask a Mortician on YouTube. She's got a book out called From Here to Eternity and When Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. Hearing her book in her voice really does bring you to a point where you get much more out of reading the book by not reading the book. So think about that as an option as well. And anybody can do an audiobook. Their Audible makes it really easy, and all the profits are yours. All of them. It's with very small amount for Audible.
Any technology or media that's your resource. I mean, we have the podcast. Sometimes people will listen to a podcast. They will see or hear an interview. Brian does his radio show. where it's like maybe an audience that you wouldn't be reaching because maybe they're not, you know, readers per se, but they may see or hear something that they like.
Yeah, people listen to stories, yeah.
Yeah, wrap it up.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. It's been a great panel. I think we learned a lot. Had a good time.